Good evening, friends. Uh, Today it is 8th of July, and we are meeting once again after about 15 days. Last meeting it was on for 24th of June, and those who are joining for the first time, I may repeat quickly some of the things. We have a WhatsApp group called as Income Tax Appeals, in which we discuss only matters related to income tax appeal. And the purpose of the group is actually to physically meet or meet online and discuss the important matters related to income tax appeals only. We had several lectures before, and we have a YouTube channel also. The link of the same is also provided in the WhatsApp group. So people can actually go back and watch what has happened in the past and what discussions have taken place. This meeting place takes place. Uniqueness is that it takes place in the night at around 9:30, and we sit up to maximum 11 o'clock. Uh, so last time we had Mr. Akshay Kenkre with us, and he's an expert in transfer pricing. And primarily, last time he just took an overview, and exactly what he discussed last time, he will take a overview in the first 5 to 10 minutes. But it was quite interesting, especially the aspect related to deemed international transaction, which was quite new to some of us. And he's going to take us through some of the uh, methods or some tricks whereby how to avoid the litigation, and of course if there is a litigation, uh, how to actually come out of that, what kind of arguments can be made, what the TPs are expecting, transfer pricing officers are expecting from the the assessments that are taking place, and how to counter argue and how to prepare yourself. So this is very important. So when we talk about the litigation, it's not always that you are there for arguing the litigation. Sometimes it is also important that how to avoid the litigation in the first place, and if at all, if the litigation comes up, then what are the things that we should be ready with. So this is how the Akshay is going to help us, because transfer pricing, as we last time discussed, is a very specialized subject, and people are not expected to touch it unless and until you have a complete knowledge of it, or at least a fairly good and reasonable knowledge of it. Otherwise, you may end up making a mess of the case, which may otherwise be considered as a straightforward case. So Akshay is practicing for quite some time. He has 3 books to his credit till now. I will let you know the names of the books as we progress, sometimes in between when all the people are joined, or maybe little at the end. And I'm sure that all of you have heard what he had said in the last meeting, if you are not present through the YouTube. But still, he will take us through quickly a kind of a tour of what we did last time, so that we get a continuity. Uh, One important aspect is that of this meeting is that people can actually stop him in between to ask some questions or get some clarification. However, it should be coming after certain period of time. So maybe the speaker will give some time after he has explained the point, and he will say that whatever I have discussed till now, if anybody wants to discuss or ask the questions, they can do that, so that the flow of his explanation will not be lost. So this is how our meetings are very much different from the lecture meeting. So we never call this as a lecture meeting. These are the discussions meeting, and over a period of time, people have realized these are more important or more useful than the lecture meeting. And let me tell you that if these are the discussion meetings, then the level of knowledge that a person who is actually be a facilitator has to be uh, more than the normal lecturer, because the lecturer comes and prepares and speaks on a particular subject and goes away. Nobody asks him, although at the end some people do ask the questions. But here people can stop the facilitator. But let me tell you one more thing, that we have a lot of experts in the field, and therefore only the speaker is not the one who is the final authority on the subject. So if you have something more more important, or if you have more knowledge on a particular point, you please come forward and explain your experiences, your point, and the speaker will not feel anything about it, that I am the speaker or I am the facilitator and how this person is coming forward. Nothing like that, because all are equal. What is more important is that we have to gain the knowledge out of it. So there is nothing like who is expert, who is not expert. And whatever maybe your simple queries can also be asked, because there are junior members to medium level members to senior members. With this brief introduction, I'll not take Akshay's too much of time. Akshay, you can take over and you can start with your uh, explanation in your usual style. Okay, thank you very much. Akshay, you can start.
Yeah, thank you, Sagar sir. I hope I'm audible enough and clear.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think before I start, a very quick announcement. If anybody is joining in and joined in, it would be nice to put the mics on mute. Otherwise, because this is more of a group meeting, uh, somewhere it becomes difficult to mute everybody. Anybody who wants to speak can unmute it, as Sagar sir said. Now, I would just like to make a quick roundup in terms of what we had discussed last time. Uh, so, are, is the screen moving for everyone? Okay,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So we had an agenda of looking at an overview of transfer pricing and transfer pricing audits, and the part two of agenda was mainly on the BEPS action plan around the master file and CBCR reporting and the local file. Now, with this, we went back in time in terms of how transfer pricing started in India, how it has developed in terms of one of the most impactful laws uh, until 2013 and even today to say, but then it has changed its color from say being a law which is negatively impacting to a law which is more proactive, planned oriented law from 2014 to 20, uh, and adding a lot of value to tax anti-avoidance measures by the Indian government as well as the various governments across the globe with the BEPS measures and others. We went on to see the entire litigation journey, how transfer pricing litigation has panned up. Uh, Now, this was a quick chart which was showcased, uh, where the orange color boxes represented the litigation or maybe the cases that were selected for scrutiny, and the gray color bars were the adjustment in rupees crores. If you see 2013, the adjustment was at the highest, and then the adjustment came down with the lower aggressiveness showcased by the tax authorities. Now, moving on, we discussed on the entire compliance chart, and the compliance timeline for transfer pricing for this year is 30th November, which is for year 2021. We discussed a very interesting concept of 3D, uh, which is 3D pillars of transfer pricing, which starts with the design phase, which is the planning of a particular document or designing that particular document, which helps in bringing in a lot of clarity to the supply chain, which goes on to compliance, which is the second pillar, which is document, and then to defense. And defense could be proactive as well as responsive. TP especially is, sorry, there is some background. My request, if everybody can just mute. Yeah. So defense is of two types. One is the proactive defense, and the second one is responsive. I think transfer pricing is one of the areas where a proactive defense option is available. in the nature of advanced pricing agreements. In fact, today itself, I had a wonderful meeting with the commissioners. This was in Bangalore for one of the APA cases that we are handling, and the proactive defense in APA is very much different than how a normal assessment happens, because this is very business oriented. The tax authorities, the APA authorities really want to strike the deal and to look at mainly the price setting rather than price testing. Setting is something that you plan and you do earlier to your compliance, and testing is something that you do in the compliance. So the testing is the document phase, setting is the design phase. So the APA authorities really look at the design phase, and I would love to talk about APA if somebody has any questions today, and because that's the future of transfer pricing going ahead. We spoke about various forms in transfer pricing. We went into transfer pricing audits, and we saw all other audits which are encircling transfer pricing as a subject. We looked at certain basics of TP audit, and this entire discussion circled around three main aspects of TP audit, that is examination, uh, opinion or placing the opinion, and the correctness on true and correctness of transfer pricing audit vis-a-vis true and fair. So we fairly went into detail while we are looking at the examination phase, the opinion phase, and also the correctness phase of transfer pricing audits. We discussed the flow, and we stopped on serial number, or maybe page number 18, where we had to look at the annexure to the report that we are providing in Form 3 CEB. Are we all on the same page? Sagar sir, is this well covered as far as what we spoke last time? You want to add something?
Uh, we can actually talk a little more on the deemed international transaction because that was very important.
Okay, sure. So we discussed a very interesting concept that was deemed international transaction, which is not prevalent in any of the OECD-based guidance or even countries, where cases that are triangulation cases are covered. Now I'll elaborate this a little bit. It means those cases where a third party is artificially put in between two associated enterprises, so that an associated enterprise one transacts with an independent party, and the independent party then transacts with, say, the Indian company, which is an associated
Mm,
enterprise of the first party.
mm,
Yeah. Now, in such a case, the transaction or the transaction of triangulation is covered under deemed international transaction, and that is specifically mentioned in section 92B2. And the conditions are, if the transaction between an independent party and, say, the Indian company are ineffectively controlled by the foreign associated enterprise, the terms and conditions are controlled by the foreign associated enterprise, then the transaction between the independent party and the Indian party would be subject to transfer pricing regulations. Now, this third party could either be a non resident or it could be a resident. Now, even if it is a resident, it is not a specified domestic transaction. It's a deemed international transaction. It's a very special concept which is placed in our law, so that there is no circling around the transfer pricing law by placing independent parties in between. We generally call such parties as accommodating parties. This concept is also explained in the GAR, section 95 GAR. The accommodating party concept is also explained there. So we never wanted an accommodating party in the transfer pricing regime, and that's why we have that concept of deemed international transaction. Something of interest, because it's very hard to find a deemed international transaction from an auditor's point of view, and hence there could be certain checks and measures that could be applied to find out the deemed international transaction, and that's something that we discussed last time. Any further queries, I'm more than happy to answer the questions here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm willing to say, yeah. Can I ask one question, please, Mr. Akshay?
Yes, Milinji.
Yeah. See, last time I think we discussed about this, and you did answer that, but somehow still it is in my mind. That's why I'm repeating that question again. Uh, Suppose A and B are related parties in India and the US. A company uses C company for last leg of the process, whatever manufacturing process of that particular product which they want to export to India from the US.
Yes.
So when they are using somebody else for completing that last process,
Yes.
and that company, which is an independent company, is exporting that product into Indian market, from the Indian company, then it is very difficult for somebody in India to really go through the documentation and find out whether they are related parties, I mean indirectly related parties or not. And if so, I mean that is one, that is from auditor's point of view. Secondly, for transfer pricing point of view, since the intermediary is adding value to the product, how can we really say that it's a related party, or why it should come under this ambit? I mean, I'm still trying to understand. Last time we discussed about it, you did answer, but still it is in my mind. So I thought, let me repeat this question.
No, sure, surely happy to clarify. See, in this case, upfront, you can't say that it's a deemed international transaction. We need to see whether the transaction between this intermediary company and the Indian company is influenced by the parent company. And the way this could be established is by comparing, say, the terms and conditions which are between this intermediary company and the Indian company, and see whether those terms and conditions would be accepted in any normal independent conditions. So it's a little bit theoretical.
Yeah, because they can always put it in writing. I mean, normal conditions. I mean, if just to avoid whole transfer pricing mechanism.
Correct. But ultimately, if India is, say, purchasing 50-60% of raw materials from this particular independent enterprise, then there would be questions around why this particular enterprise. And then maybe the answer would be that my parent company has told to purchase from this enterprise. Now, this is enough to find out that this particular enterprise from where India is purchasing could potentially be an enterprise with whom a deemed international transaction is struck. Now, assumingly this amount is not 50-60% and it's only 1, 2, or 3%, then frankly, it's not very substantial enough to trigger transfer pricing.
Sorry.
And
Okay.
in such a case, it could be ignored. I mean, ultimately, we also need to see materiality and what is the impact that it is having on the tax that is being paid. Now, in your example, if there is a substantial transaction with the Indian company, then such a transaction needs to be scrutinized from all the angles.
Fair enough. I understand that. But as far as the terms are concerned between the independent company and Indian company are standard conditions, which any other company would have, kept it in the agreement. Just because they are having some linkages with the parent company, does it get you into the deemed transfer pricing mechanism?
So, Milinji, that is something that we need to evaluate. Now, the fact is, I'm saying we need to evaluate and take a position on. The answer is as broad as, say, whether there is going to be a PE or not, or a permanent establishment or not. Having a PE or not having a PE is not bad. It's just that we need to evaluate the situation and take a decision accordingly. Now, either ways, I mean, it depends completely on the facts of the cases. Now, if parent company is putting a lot of influence on this intermediary company, and that is somehow proven in writing, forget the contract, but in the substantial action, if it is proven that there is a lot of influence of the parent company, then somehow it could be proven because of some amount of paperwork here and there. So contract is not the only thing that we will look at. We will also look at substance over form.
So, from auditors' point of view in India, what are the measures they should look at? I mean, for this similar transaction, so that auditors don't get into any trouble.
So, from a guidance notes perspective, we are not expected to be a James Bond in finding deemed international transaction. That is something that we should ask as a question to the management, and we should explain them whether there is a transaction like this, kindly disclose. And if the answer to that is going to be no, we do not have any transactions to it, we should do all the examinations, do all the scrutiny. If we still are not finding such transactions, then it's we are the institute or anybody is not expecting the auditor to be a detective here. So until and unless it is very evident, such transactions are very hard to find as well as give an opinion on. So surely we should take something like a management representation letter to protect ourselves in terms of any future occurrences. So that's something that we need to undertake, Milinji. But
Fine.
otherwise, I agree with you. It's difficult.
Yeah. Fine. Thank you. Thank you. And sorry for asking this question again this time.
No, 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 absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. Great. So let's look at the annexures which are there in Form 3CB. And for that, there are certain principles that we need to follow. First of all, while we are reporting the transactions in Form 3CB, even from an assessment and appeal point of view, these are transaction by transaction reporting in Form 3CB. Now, transaction does not mean all individual sale transactions, but a class of transactions put together. So, if I'm selling certain products to a particular associated enterprise, so I should say sale of products or sale of, say, let's say mobiles, sale of mobiles to associated enterprise. It is not expected that we write each and every transaction in the Form 3CB. Also, because Form 3CB, we are not following double entry system, it's important to eliminate any type of duplicates. If you are reporting sales, you don't need to report debtors until and unless the debtors are overdue. To try and eliminate duplicates so that the compliance burden could be reduced. So again, I would say it's not a double entry system that we are trying to put in place in Form 3CB. Third is any type of differences in opinion between the management and the auditor could be reported in the notes to Form 3CB. Like we have notes to Form 3CD, there is also notes to Form 3CEB where you can write certain differences in opinion, and it's absolutely fine because if a management thinks that a cost plus method is an important method to follow, but the auditor thinks TNMM is the method to follow, please report that difference in Form 3CB. Any type of inconsistency in Form 3CB, especially say deemed international transactions, specified domestic transactions, the way how it is written in the law, that will always override the form, that is Form 3CB. So law will take a higher part in terms of decision whether that needs to be reported or not. A Form 3CB is mainly divided into two parts, which is the international transactions and domestic transaction. In fact, three parts. Part A is more of a general information. Part B is international information, international transaction information. And Part C is the specified domestic transaction information. Uh, there is a place where they also ask for quantitative details. Uh, and the reason for this could be uh, possibly if you divide the total number of international transactions by the quantitative detail, you will get a price per unit. Yeah. So you will get uh, that price per unit, and such a price per unit is helpful in the cup method, right? Now, it's not always possible to provide a lot of quantitative details for each and every transaction. Either you can provide an aggregate quantitative details, or you can choose to provide a note that there are so many different SKUs that we are not able to provide quantitative details, and such notes should be well clarified for. Then if there is any relationship, especially as Milinji said, that you are not able to conclude whether that particular relationship will lead to an A type of a relationship or not, A is associated enterprise relationship or not, a chartered accountant should clearly mention that in the notes to Form 3CEB. Yeah. And most importantly, let's look at the responsibility. It's the management's responsibility to maintain the documentation. as similar to that, it's a management's responsibility to maintain the financial information and financial statements. Your responsibility is only to provide an opinion on whether that transaction is undertaken at arm's length or not, based on the documentation maintained by the management. Yeah. Also important to obtain a management representation letter. Now, how to identify associated enterprises? Now, outside deemed international transactions, there could be 100 ways to find out associated enterprise. Some of those which are generally used are if you attack the related party transaction, that's the first place where you can look at certain related parties uh, which are possibly also associated enterprises. But the definition of related party under AS 18 could be different than the definition under the transfer pricing regulations, and hence there could be other aspects also which you may need to cover to find out whether certain transactions are entered between associated enterprises or not. And those could be as simple as an organizational chart. While you're say discussing with the management, that could be a management memo with where they have placed certain associated enterprises in the discussion, and then you circle back and try to find out the relationship. The shareholders register, the investment register, uh, various contract reviews when you do certain internal control procedures. If you are working in, say, in an accounting software, uh, which is a robust accounting software, there are certain accounts and codes which specifically tags the related party accounts. So you can follow and understand those accounts. And last but not the least, uh, say various ledgers that you scrutinize, surely will come to know with the same names that they might have, uh, and the operations that they are undertaking, whether they are of the same supply chain or not. These could be important elements in audit while you are trying to conclude on the associated enterprises for the entire year that are there in the picture. Moving forward, I would like to cover a transaction by transaction understanding of various international transactions that are reported in Form 3CB. And I would love to even hear your experience on these transactions in any of your clients that you would have come across. And I would like to tag them to the assessments and the appeals that we have. So the first one is simple tangible property. Now the entire 3CB that flows, it flows in the way how uh, your section 92B is defined in terms of international transactions. There were certain clarificatory amendments which were brought in 2012. Most of the entire 3CB covers that. So clause 11 of Form 3CB talks of tangible goods, either a buy of tangible goods, selling of tangible goods. These could be raw material purchase and sales. This could be finished goods purchase and sales, which is trading basically, or it also could be certain fixed assets and machineries purchase and sales. So any of you have any specific comments in and around tangible properties, any experiences that you would like to share here in terms of appeals, assessments, any undervalued uh, appeals that any undervalued uh, goods that could have been challenged in some of your clients? Is that a case?
Akshayji, where will reimbursement of expenses fall?
Reimbursement of expenses will fall in clause 19, which says any other transaction.
So at that time I will ask.
Okay. You can also ask now, not an issue.
So the question is, really speaking, if at all I am claiming reimbursement of expenses from an associate enterprise,
Yeah.
which is really speaking, we experienced that the amount was claimed from them on cost to cost basis. It was actually the expenditure which was incurred.
Yes.
Now, it was shown under loans and advances in the balance sheet.
Okay.
And associate enterprise was paying it regularly also.
Sure.
But there was a debit note going along with the proofs and everything.
Sure.
Somehow or the other, transfer pricing officer, he applied that method and entire reimbursement of expenses he added
Hmm.
under that particular assessment. That is what I wanted to just ask you. That technically speaking, in reimbursement of expenses, which is shown under loans and advances, what should be our approach? That I have not debited it to profit and loss account, so I have not claimed this as an expense. So transfer pricing adjustment whether will apply to this reimbursement of expense. That's what was the question.
Right, right. So, what is a reimbursement of expense? It's any expense. First of all, it is not for, uh, say, your business expenditure reasons. That's one. That's the first characteristic of it. You have incurred that expenditure on somebody else's behalf. So, it was never your expenditure. Point number two, it is ideally on a cost to cost basis. There is absolutely no profit element in the reimbursement of expenditure, right? And point number three, there is a documentation available, which is a back to back documentation. There are third party proofs to prove that such an expenditure is a reimbursement of expenditure. If you follow all these three, ideally, in most of the cases that I have seen, the TPOs are not harping upon adding back the reimbursement of expenditure. It's only when we are not able to prove that these are indeed reimbursements, uh, then they think that this is not reimbursement, this is some service provision that has happened, and that's why you are getting this particular income or you are making this particular expenditure. So, Pramodji, in your case, were you able to give all back-to-back documentation to the last extent?
No, unfortunately, what happened, we were not involved at the time of the actual TP assessment, before the
Okay.
TPO.
Okay.
But what I am surprised is actually when the amount is reflected in the balance sheet, how
Right.
far an addition of the entire amount of reimbursement, which is really speaking the total reimbursement which is claimed on cost to cost basis, would have been a subject matter of the TP adjustment. That's what is the question.
So that needs to be substantiated. If the amount is substantiated stating that it's back to back, then ideally there shouldn't have been an adjustment. I'm sure there is something would have gone wrong somewhere,
Yeah.
but ideally no issues in terms of reimbursement. And we as auditors also, when we put anything in clause 19, we always state that it has to be back to back. There is no profit element here. And we also have third party proofs. Until and unless these three conditions are met, clause number 19, we do not incorporate anything there.
Yeah, what earlier we used to take a stand as far as the service tax levy, more or
Hmm.
less. That should be substantial, I suppose, so that it is cost to cost and there is no profit element involved in this. And therefore, the question of any service tax earlier, of course,
Hmm.
now with GST, the things are different.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Sure, sir. Sure. Okay. Clause number 12 talks about intangible property. Now, I would like to state here that when we are talking of transfer pricing, all clauses on one side and clause 12 on another side. The reason is 80 to 85% of value of a multinational company or a business is driven by intangibles and nothing else. Intangible is one of just a second. Huh? Sorry, I'm not able to mute. Huh? Okay, anyways, I'll continue. So intangible properties bring out the maximum value for any business. Uh, Hello, Umaji, hello.
Select mute all in the participants. Akshay,
Okay,
select mute all in the participants list. It's
okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot for the tip. Yeah. So intangible property basically is extremely fluid in nature. It could be transferred from anywhere to anywhere, and all you need are certain pieces of papers assigning the intangible property from, say, one associated enterprise to another associated enterprise. So it is extremely fluid, and the major tax avoidance that happens, and especially the base erosion that happens globally, is linked to intangible properties. Okay, countries like US, UK, Netherlands, these are trying to tap the intangible properties, and they are also trying to build upon their entire economy on intellectual properties. So if that base is shifted or placed in a particular jurisdiction, then the income stream is attributed to such a base. And that's why, from a TP point of view, many a times we forget it as CAs, taxpayers forget it as the businessmen and also tax officers, that they need to attack and focus on the IPs in the business and not tangible properties. Tangible properties will solve short term issues, but long term damage is generally made by intangible property because they have a potential to erode an entire base of a country. Any experiences around intangible property in this group? Would love to hear. I will first give certain examples of this. Vidyadhar, yes, definitely, I'll come to you. Uh, if there are any royalties that India is paying somewhere, okay, it's a part of revenue IP being shifted. However, there could be possibilities that the base of IP itself, so patent itself, is transferred from, say, one country to another. India makes an entire patent, registers it, and immediately transfers the patent before any commercialization of that patent happens. Okay. Now, such a transfer of patent could happen today at a lower value, but that patent ideally is a very high value patent. And such a high value patent would get revenues attached to it only in the future and not today. So I'm just taking patent as one example. There could be thousand others. And frankly, if you ask me where you see TP 5 years down the line, I would say TP is then all revolving around IPs and valuations, which it is not happening today. So with this, I would like to come to Vidyadhar ji.
Yes, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
Before 30 years back, there is a agreement entered with the associated enterprises for royalty payable per piece of the production,
Yeah,
which has been approved by the RBI at that time.
sure.
And that is still going on. Now, the question is, since it has been approved by the RBI, can we say that it is an arm's length?
Okay. So RBI is under a separate law. RBI as a jurisdiction, as a jurisdictional body in India, was never made to find out whether there is tax avoidance happening or not. So 30 years back, RBI was in a very different form. Uh, Frankly, RBI law is different. Transfer pricing law never even existed at that point of time. It only came in 2001,
Correct.
2002. So we cannot take shelter stating that this particular transaction is covered by RBI regulations. every year on year, there needs to be testing of arm's length conditions and arm's length price. When I say price, it's not only the price, it is the entire gamut of conditions also around it. And we need to evaluate if there are independent transactions available in the public domain who have entered into similar transactions, may not be 30 years back, but 5 years back, but still which are going on for similar type of a property. Then what type of royalties have been paid for them? Possibly in this case, because you are paying royalty, maybe the royalty rate is low, there is no issue. But think about it when you are getting that particular royalty. Yeah.
Okay.
So I would say that RBI and TP are not comparable, and we should not rely inter law wise.
Okay. We cannot take the shelter of the RBI in that case.
No. Ideally not.
But even though suppose the basis of royalty has been decided per piece of the production,
Yeah.
suppose 10 rupees per piece of the production, and value is low,
Yeah.
and it has been audited by the local auditor in that country, and he had certified that the 10 rupees per piece has been manufactured and it has been due as per this agreement.
Yeah.
How far till date the department has not come on this transaction, whether it is arm's length or it is not an arm's length. There we were succeeding about that this is being RBI had approved, and then TP officer has not seen. He had seen that agreement and he said okay fine, but how far it is correct, that is what I was of the view.
First of all, good news that he saw the agreement and he said that it is fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, but ideally from a technical analysis point of view, this particular position might fail, because
Okay.
in TP there is a separate analysis, because TP is ultimately valuation. There is a separate analysis of royalty transaction that needs to be undertaken. Either you go under the net margin approach or you look at third party agreements in this case. We will not be able to substantiate with RBI. Of course, many companies do, but ideally, if they are scrutinized thoroughly, then there would be issues in that.
And second question regarding about the bank guarantee which has been given by the Indian company to foreign subsidiary, whether that will be considered as a transaction per se?
So the risk that you are undertaken while giving a corporate guarantee to the foreign company, the
Yeah.
risk is a transaction. The corporate guarantee per se is not. I mean, many people confuse in this. When I say risk, which means this should be actual de facto risk that you are taking. And
Yeah.
only when there is certain amount of benefit that is passed on to the foreign company, and all of these needs to be proven and documented in the transfer pricing documentation, then only there could be certain guarantee fees that could be attached to it.
Okay.
Okay.
So risk would be a transaction, you mean to say? A risk can be considered as a transaction?
Yes. So what is a guarantee? So let me come to clause 15 here. What is a guarantee? When you are extending a loan, now I'm trying to mix clause 14 and clause 15. When you are extending a loan, that loan has a certain repayment and it also has certain interest component. That interest component is broken into various parts. There is a risk-free rate of return. Okay. There is some time value of money that is there. So that is added to it. There is some risk premium that is added to it. There is some country premium that is added to it. And ultimately the summation of all of these, including beta and all those aspects, complex valuation aspects, you get one interest rate. Now the risk component in that. So here you are not extending the funds, which means your funds are not getting used. But the foreign company, based on your risk appetite, is trying to get funds from certain third parties. And for that, you are taking a risk. And that's why the concept of guarantee is that you are parting with your risk so that the foreign company is ultimately getting certain gains from third parties. And that's why the foreign company should compensate the parent company or a group company for undertaking the risk for themselves.
Okay.
Okay, so it's one component of interest. That is the risk return. And that is something which the Indian company would be undertaking in your example.
Okay. So in that case, which method should we consider for this transfer pricing purpose?
Oh, it's a tricky question. Depends a lot on fact of the case itself. But benchmarking of corporate guarantees, it's an art in itself. So
Yeah.
ideally, earlier people were looking at a cup, but now mainly they look at any other method and do a
Okay.
lot of background work, because this involves quasi credit rating the borrower and the lender company here, and to find out by giving such a guarantee whether there is any type of benefit that has accrued to the foreign company or not.
Hmm, hmm.
Okay.
No, but then
Only
when these foreign companies borrowing the funds from the bank and the parent company, which is Indian company, is extending corporate guarantee to the bank, okay, in case of the default by this my subsidiary, I will compensate to you.
that's correct. That is
So,
the risk
so
that you're carrying.
correct. That's the risk. But I am not into the lending business. And
That's correct.
can we consider that since I'm not into lending business, so this will be considered as any other method?
Yeah, so method is any other method, but the way how the benchmarking of this needs to happen is through a very detailed credit rating process, and then going through the
Okay.
various documentation and a third party guarantee documentation to find out for such type of credit rating companies what type of guarantees have been extended.
But can we compare with the methodology which has been applied by the credit rating companies versus mine is manufacturing company? So how can we get it a comparison for this purpose?
So we need to undertake credit rating. We don't appoint the
Okay.
credit rating agencies. Uh,
Okay.
on various parameters, we use complex credit rating models, say by Moody's. Okay, these are updated models always, S&P, and based on that, we arrive at the credit rating and then find out for such credit rating what is the default risk that is generally involved. Again, I would say it's a little bit complex in terms of how you find it. There is a
Yeah.
different methodology to it. There is a third party database that we need to scan and find out those agreements.
Okay.
But that's something that we generally do, and this is
Okay.
what is accepted even by the tax authorities.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I extend this particular Swanish's question a little further?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
There are a couple of transactions which I have seen where one parent company's bank issues the bank guarantee or bank comfort letter, and in the other country, against this, the company gets the loan.
Yeah.
Now, how will you view this transaction from transfer pricing?
Yeah. So that's exactly I explained to Vidyadhar ji
So
also
the
from a.
same parameter will apply what you mentioned for company guarantee.
Yes, absolutely. The same parameters will apply,
In case
and
of
we.
bank guarantee, bank is charging some commission to, let's say, Indian company or foreign company. So can it not be treated as cost or whatever, and then accordingly view it?
Absolutely, that could also be seen. Whatever commission the bank is charging, that could predominantly act as a cup transaction in itself. If the bank is actually charging a commission in this case, and such commission could act as a comparable in the transaction like this.
Yeah. So because in case of a corporate guarantee, it is little difficult because you need to value and what risk is. But in case of a bank guarantee, there is a clear cut bank guarantee commission or whatever, and that can be the basis on which you can really look.
Absolutely. Because banks will come out with that commission only with the methodologies that I explained. So you can really compare bank commission rates in your case only, not so you cannot take naked bank commission guarantee commission rates. So there
Yeah,
are bank
exactly.
guarantee commissions which are also published on various banks' website. We cannot take that because those are not comparable transactions.
Exactly.
That's only
Exactly.
a proposal.
Yeah. Now, exactly on the same lines, then bank guarantee, bank will charge you the guarantee fee depending on your strength here in India or in the US.
Yes.
Obviously, that bank guarantee commission will depend upon your strength. So obviously, it will be lower than the normal bank guarantee commission rate. So
Yeah.
will it affect the transfer pricing?
Yes, that's correct. So whatever charge is being made to the Indian company, it's expected that the foreign company makes good that charge, and the Indian company is devolved of any type of default risk here.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Yeah,
Akshayji, it will apply to SBLC also the same way?
absolutely the same way.
Okay.
SBLC is a type of bank guarantee itself,
Yeah.
just as a working capital, nothing
Yeah,
else.
actually, I was referring to SBLCs to tell you honestly, because many transactions did take place on the basis of SBLCs.
Yeah,
I thought
absolutely.
as much, Milind. That is the reason I got it clarified. That's right.
Yeah, SBLC is also covered.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, clause 13 speaks about specific provision and receipt of services. Now, there had been certain clarifications around it, and the entire provision of services, the definition has been expanded to include any type of services, stating even the services for market research or for development of certain intangibles also. If there is a service that is being provided, for example, certain R&D services, that also forms a part of provision and receipt of services under clause 13. Clause 14 specifically talks about the lending and borrowing of money. It could be in any form, but it should revolve around debt and not equity. So any type of debentures, any type of receivables that we are looking at, any extended overdue receivables will come in clause 14. Clause 15 we just discussed, which are on guarantees. Clause 16, a controversial one. This is the equity transaction, okay, which is either you are issuing an equity or purchasing and selling an equity. Ideally, issuing of equity does not have any type of profit elements attached to it, but such a transaction was challenged in Vodafone case, uh, and it climbed to Bombay High Court, and Bombay High Court clearly suggested that equity issue transactions are not transaction that needs to be compared for an arm's length transaction. And this particular stand is also now accepted by the department. In writing, they have accepted this. But we need to be careful that issue of equity to the foreign company vis-a-vis sale and purchase of equity are going to be different. So the Bombay High Court does not talk of purchase and sale of equity. It only talks of issue of equity, right? Even though if there is an issue of equity and you don't want to comment on the valuation of the equity, although you have the valuation report and you can rely on it, uh, as a chartered accountant auditing the transfer pricing, uh, it is fine if you are not commenting on the arm's length nature of such issue. But when there is a purchase and sale or buyback, we need to comment on the arm's length nature of that. Yeah. Clause 17 is quite interesting, which is on the cost
Sorry,
contribution and
Akshay,
cost.
Akshayji, can I interrupt you? Yeah.
100%, 100%.
Yeah. In lending and borrowing, can you please elaborate something with reference to the changes likely to take place in LIBOR? And in equity transactions, can you elaborate about the preference shares? That's what.
Yeah, yeah. So let me speak a little bit about LIBOR first. So LIBOR will not be now published in few months, and here then we need to look at certain different base of comparison rather than LIBOR. So we might look at Euribor or maybe any other type of interbank rates, but LIBOR will be stopped. I mean, it will stop getting published in few months from now, or it would have already stopped. Uh, and that was mainly due to certain frauds that had undertaken. I don't have a lot of details on the frauds, but that's the reason why they will not be publishing LIBORs anymore. But we need to look at any other base when LIBOR will not exist. So that's my view on LIBOR. And in equity transactions, any type of preference shares, uh, So those you could ideally put in the equity side of it. These are issue of preference shares, and preference shares could be treated as equity transaction as far as TP is concerned, and this could be treated very similar to how a issue of equity share would happen. Pramodji, is there any specific that you would like to ask me from the preference shares point of view?
Because what I thought was actually the RBI sometimes was treating preference shares for FEMA purposes like a debt. That is the reason I tried to correlate it with lending borrowing when you came to equity. That is what was in my mind. But possibly I may be wrong.
No. So RBI and TP somehow we should not mix both of those. Uh, the reason why RBI always treats preference shares as lending or borrowing, because it has more of a characteristics of a debt instrument, and there is a concept of hybrid instruments. I mean, preference shares, I would say, are almost like hybrid instruments. And if you are not falling either as a debt or equity, there could be certain issues in and around. If I talk about taxes, could be tax avoidance itself. And the BEPS action plan number 2 was specifically crafted against these hybrid instruments. Hence, to avoid any confusion, RBI has specifically categorized preference shares as debt. Uh, but depending on the nature of it, either in TP you can consider it an equity transaction, or maybe a lending or borrowing. But I think it's more of an equity transaction when it comes to preference shares. It's clearly stated in either clause 14 or clause 16. I need to go back to the clause to see it, but I think it's going to be clause 16 here because it's more equity.
So what you are saying actually, that is the way sometimes the classifications are done for Ind AS purposes, that what you are saying, that the instruments which are equity in nature, but basically that is being classified partly in loan and all these things. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And then the next one is an interesting concept, which is the mutual agreements. And there are three concepts here: cost contribution, cost allocation, and apportionment. Any one of you can throw some light or maybe experiences on the differences between cost contribution and cost allocation? Has anybody come across transactions like these? Anybody is aware what is cost contribution and how it is different than cost allocation, or are these actually different or same? We can have a discussion based session, no worries. Okay, so let me explain. Cost allocation. Yes.
I would want to, sorry. I
Hey,
think
hi, Prerna.
hi. Cost contribution would be something towards, like, say, for example, that the two related companies are intending to develop some IP and both of them are equivalently contributing or in some decided ratio. Whereas I think allocation would be based certain expenditure, say for example, is incurred by a parent company and then it is allocated based on some drivers amongst subsidiaries like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
So cost contribution is something where for a development of IP, two or more associated enterprises are contributing the cost, so that after the development, the benefit of that IP is enjoyed by various A's that has contributed in similar ratio. That is cost contribution. It is more towards, I would say, development of an IP, right? Whereas cost allocation is like one associated enterprise has incurred a cost, and then that cost is allocated between other associated enterprises. That could be, for example, management fees, or it could be, say, license cost, which is allocated between various enterprises. That's the main difference. And that is something that clause number 17 is expecting us to cover.
Actually, in that case, the companies like Philips or some of the big names, where they have Indian outfit, who help them in developing some of the products or some of the processes. Now, how will they do transfer pricing for such things?
So when they are developing a process for the entire, yeah, when they are developing a process for the entire group, now ideally development of process is not development of an IP, and they would have hired, say, certain engineers here to develop that particular process. Now, in such a case, the efforts taken by Philips could be treated as efforts towards services for development of something, and that particular efforts could be remunerated on a cost plus basis by Philips global entities to India, because that process development is happening for the entire globe and not only for India.
But do they really allocate certain revenue to India company or any? I mean, I just gave an example of Philips, but there are many companies who are doing, their, R&D centers are in India. So do they really do that, revenue recognition like that?
Yeah, absolutely. The entire, so assumingly there is a R&D center, most of the time the R&D center in India is a low risk R&D, which is not taking any substantial function. And such an R&D function is remunerated at a cost plus basis by the parent company to India. And by doing so, the outcome of the R&D is ultimately transferred to the parent company, and the parent company starts owning the intangible property. So the contract that is there between the parent company and the Indian company is for provision of R&D services by India to the parent company or the IP holder company,
So
whatever you can
basically,
say.
then that means they will be using cost plus basis methodology in any case, because they won't be going beyond that.
So I told you about the methodology for fixation. By testing, you can always test it on a net method, which is TNMM method.
But sir, can cost allocation will be considered as a reimbursement of expenses if it has been backed by the agreement and supporting documents?
No, so reimbursement of expense and cost allocation is a little bit different. Friend, I'll come to you in a while.
Okay.
Reimbursement means that there is a third party invoice which is incurred by one entity where that entity was not supposed to incur that expenditure, and the business expenditure belonged to my associated enterprise. And that amount is paid by associated enterprise 1 to, say, the Indian company or AE2 for a third party invoice that has been incurred. Now, cost allocation may not mean a third party always. It could very well mean that this entire cost is actually incurred by a cost center in India, and that cost could also mean employee cost, which is there, and ultimately this employee cost at certain amount of markup is getting allocated amongst the various countries or associated enterprises where the services have been provided. So the difference could be internal and external, but cost allocation is much more than reimbursement, and cost allocation could also have a markup element which reimbursement doesn't.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, Prerna.
I have just one query to the first thing you answered, which is regarding that, say, for example, you said that with regard to this IP. So if we have an IP wherein these back offices are there and they are developing the software for some parent company, now would it be called as the provision of service or would it count as cost contribution?
So, okay, now cost contribution is different than provision of services. Now, if there are two companies which are going to act for a common goal to get an IP recognized in their own names, that is cost contribution, which means the Indian company which is providing the R&D services will ultimately recognize the IP to its own name, and it is doing all the services for itself. So there is a concept of DEMP, of course you would know: development, enhancement, maintenance, protection, and exploitation. If all these DEMP are going to be with India, then certain portion of that would belong to India and certain portion
Right.
of that would belong to the foreign company. This is cost contribution. Vis-a-vis the service, provision of service or R&D services is where the Indian company is only acting on the instruction of the foreign company to undertake certain operational R&D activities, where the results of the R&D activities are ultimately transferred to the foreign company, and that's typically an outsourcing model, to be very frank. No IPs involved, all IPs are transferred at
Yes.
the current price. Forget the future.
Right. Right.
Does that
Thank
answer?
Can I
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
can I ask a question, Akshay ji?
100%. I'm not able to see you
So
though.
uh,
Just a second. Please go ahead. Please
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah.
Aditya,
So
who is asking the question?
Yeah, actually Aditya was asking the question, but perhaps she has gone mute by mistake, looks like.
Okay.
Aditya, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
yeah, I got mute by mistake. Yes.
Yes,
Yes, I
Aditya ji.
went mute by mistake.
No
So,
worries.
in this transaction of cost contribution or cost allocations, how do we normally benchmark such transactions? Because we had a scenario in which a pharmaceutical company had done massive expenditures, and those were uh, contributed between two A's.
Hmm.
Then after that, post that they had capitalized it, and then they had amortized it, etc. So how do we normally benchmark such transactions? If you might throw some light.
Yeah, the answer is not going to be simple, but I'll try to keep it simple. And it might be a little bit theoretical because, again, it depends on facts and circumstances.
Yeah,
But
correct.
yeah, assuming it's a cost contribution and I am, say,
Mhm.
contributing 100 rupees and my foreign company is also contributing 100 rupees, and then there is an IP that gets developed and the value of IP becomes 500 rupees, 250 is recognized by company A, 250 is recognized by company B. Uh, and that 250, there will be certain amount of amortization that would be claimed, right? So
Yes.
you are an entrepreneur entity, the foreign company is also an entrepreneur entity. So typically a benchmarking method of profit split is used, and the activities that you will be undertaking after recognition of IP should actually match the recognition of IP, which means after recognizing the IP at your end, if you are going to provide only simple services to the foreign company, that means surely there is something wrong. After recognition of IPs, the company should be able to be entrepreneurial in nature so that the company is getting the residual revenue and profits, as well as taking entrepreneurial efforts, and also has economic capability to take it. Okay. Once all of these are achieved, I mean, this all goes into documentation, and the company undertakes the activity so that to absorb the entire, uh, uh, you can say, the depreciation or amortization on those intangibles, and makes a certain profit margin. Accordingly, we need to benchmark this. So it could be a combination of
Oh,
PSM and a TNMM put together, a one-stroke PSM or a two-stroke PSM. That's something how you can benchmark it.
yeah, correct.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's complicated, Aditya. It's not going to be so simple, but step by step, if you are able to defend it from a business point of view, think business, and that's how you will be able to surely justify a cost contribution. It's all about business there, and whether in independent circumstances you would have taken a similar stance.
Okay, understood.
Does that
Thank
answer
you.
your
Thank
question,
you, Akshay
Aditya?
ji. Yeah, it's pretty much complicated because use of PSM along with TNMM method, then use of two TNMM method, two searches, and use of PSM will be a bit complicated. But yes, it does answer my question. Thank you so much, Akshay ji.
Sure, Aditya, sure. Okay, moving ahead. Clause 18, specifically, this is a clause which says that any type of restructuring or reorganization, irrespective of whether it has any bearing on profit, loss, income, assets, whatever, you need to mention it. There is no requirement of mentioning the amount here because amount may not be really computed through, but it's important that all type of business restructurings are forming a part of clause 18. Of course, clause 19 is something that we discussed, which is on a reimbursement, and clause 20 is on deemed international transactions, where we had detailed discussions last time.
Actually, can I interrupt again? Sorry.
100%.
Yeah. So, I have seen some of the 3CEBs or some of the chartered accountants take a position to disclose the outstanding creditors or the debtors of the associated enterprises in clause 19, just to show that there are no extra credit period or something like that provided to them. So,
Hmm.
what is your opinion to just because even if it is coming under a normal credit period, and is it necessary to show the debit or the credit balances at the end of the year in clause 19 or in any other clause for that matter in
Right,
our form 3CEB?
right. So I think there is a very thin line of difference between compliance and over compliance. And as I said in the earlier slide, we should try to avoid duplication. Now, if a particular debtor or a creditor is already showcased in the sales, and that debtor and a
Correct.
creditor is within a credit period, ideally there is no international transaction that arises, because international transaction in terms of sales you have already included it, and any type of interest to the extent of credit period, that is already embedded in the sales value, on which you are computing
Right.
profits and on which you are paying taxes. So idealistically, you should not be over reporting anything. Otherwise, my entire Form 3CEB will become a replica of my financial statements. So it will be a mini financial statements with my foreign enterprises. So we should avoid doing that. We should report debtors transactions only when, or maybe any type of receivables, only when they are surpassing the outstanding period. And that is in clause number 14. Clause number 19, disclosure should be avoided.
Okay.
Okay, because
Okay.
ultimately
Thank
this
you.
is
Thank
all
you.
about assessment and appeals, right? If you over comply
Correct.
and go and you sit before the assessing officer, they will ask you, how have you benchmarked this clause 19? The question would be the answer
Exactly.
would be very difficult, because ultimately you will go back to either clause 11 or clause 12.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah, so yeah,
Okay.
great.
Okay.
Going forward, I think this is specified domestic transactions. I don't want to really cover this up in great detail, because as it is, the tax holiday units are going down. Only caution is now any type of transactions with startups and the new manufacturing entities is also getting covered in the specified domestic transactions. So watch out for it. Any group which is having any startups and there are any transaction between a startup and other entity, and if the transactions are crossing certain thresholds, then you need to look at specified domestic transactions. Okay. Before I come to the issues on 3CB, some very important aspects on the assessment and appeals that we should look at from a transfer pricing point of view are, first of all, at the assessment stage, okay, when you get a questionnaire, uh, don't think that the questionnaire that you have is like a question paper that you want to answer, and that's it. When you get a questionnaire, it's actually a story writing competition that you are into. And especially with the e-assessment being placed from the next years onwards, uh, the story writing will assume a lot more of importance. The way you write your transfer pricing documentation should definitely convey to the tax authorities uh, the story of your taxpayer, and stating that there is no evident transfer mispricing that is happening. So it should be very much fact oriented. It should be very much relevant. Remove any type of redundancies or irrelevance from the transfer pricing documentation. And when you're looking at assessments, I have seen that many of us put and give a lot of judicial precedence at the assessment stage itself. There is absolutely no need, because by reading those judicial precedents, TPO especially is not going to follow those. He is going to follow what the fact says, and he is going to follow whether there is an evident tax avoidance happening in the entire scheme of events or not. So my suggestion to you, especially from a TP representation point of view, is keep it simple, stay to the point, yeah, weave a story, and be very fact oriented and not so much law oriented. Start submitting a lot of judicial precedents, say at the tribunal level, and take positions there, because at that time you will be clear what position the DRP has taken, what position the assessing officer has taken. So some at DRP, some at tribunal, but not so much at the TPO level. Yeah. From an explanation point of view, if you have any explanation to do, then that explanation should be more business relevant and the client specific explanation, rather than a lot of legal oriented explanation to start with at the assessing officer level. Yeah. Now coming to certain issues in 3CB, I'll run through this slide in a quick way.
Akshay-ji,
Now, Hanji Pramod.
one small question, since you were saying about the inquiry at the time of assessment.
Yes.
If TPO is asking for a financials of the AE, how far it has a legal sanctity and how much is a compulsion that we should be submitting it?
Okay. Pramodji, again depends on facts. Why do you think the TPO is asking for financials of AE? Is it because you need to prove that you have not shifted profits outside India?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Then I think, see, he is in legal rights to ask it. At least with you. If you have it in control, you give it to him. If you don't have it in control, he can as well raise a 133 on the foreign company if he wants to get that particular document from there. But I think in all fairness, if that proves a point to you and to the TPO, we should try and comply with it if it's not going to against the TP methodology. Now, there could be a possibility where the foreign company is an entrepreneur entity and it is having huge profits at its end, and the Indian company is a low risk company and it is eligible for limited profits. In such a case, if the TPO is asking for, say, foreign company financials, until and unless you are in a stage where you have to maintain a full-fledged master file or CBCR reporting, ideally it's not right, just for the information sake. And there are provisions of automatic exchange of information. If the company is a larger company to deal with, then the CBCR report could act as a good means for the TPOs to get the information from there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Now the first issue here is when I am an associated enterprise. Suppose I become an associated enterprise with my foreign company on 1st March of certain year. Whether the transactions after 1st March till 31st March will be covered, or the transactions even before 1st March would be covered. Any thoughts?
I think so. For the whole year, it should be covered.
Okay, why?
Because it has become an AE in that year. So maybe going on a conservative basis, since he is a AE for a part of the year, you disclose the transaction for the whole year. Just my view, conservative view.
Okay. No, there is a right legal interpretation here. Anybody else? Okay. Now, section 92A and 92B are two exclusive sections, mutually exclusive sections. And 92A uses word that associated enterprise at any point of time during the year. it becomes an associated enterprise for the entire year. So which means if you are becoming an AE on 1st of March, ideally you are AE for the entire year and not only for 1 month. And that's why any transactions under section 92B which have been undertaken with the AE needs to be disclosed. Yeah. Possibly you can write in the TP documentation that transactions before 1st of March did not have the AE relationship idealistically, and the way the price setting happened was more on the independent way, but that's all a matter of facts. Uh, as far as the disclosure is concerned, Aditya was right. It needs to be disclosed, not on a conservative basis, but the right legal interpretation is that it should be disclosed because 92A and B are independent and it says at any point of time during the year. Fine. Moving ahead.
So Akshay, once you disclose, then per se, will that mean that TPs will get right to make the adjustments with respect to the transactions prior to 1st of March?
Now, as I said, really depends on a lot of facts here. In the TP documentation, if there was no influence of the group on the company before 1st of March, that needs to be documented, that there was no influence at all. But still, we are mentioning it in the Form 3CB because the way how the law states it. And we will only benchmark it for 1 month and not for the entire year. So that's a position that you can take, Sagar sir. But if that is not documented, then there could be all possibilities of adjustment. So all these due care need to be taken.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Akshay.
Yes. Now, second point we discussed, it's not the invoice wise, it is aggregate class of transaction wise disclosure that we need to do. Treatment of work in progress and deferred revenue, this needs to be disclosed in Form 3CB. You cannot skip out. TDS of associated enterprises borne by the taxpayer, ideally you should write it on gross and not on net because TDS is also included in the income of the assessee. Whether the transaction needs to be reported with GST or without GST, because GST is something that you are paying to the government and not to the foreign company. Revision of Form 3CB possible, it is very much possible. Technically, you can revise Form 3CB with the same timeline as the return of income because it is almost like a part of return of income. But technologically, you can revise Form 3CB at any point of time. And
any bar on revision of Form 3CB from Institute?
No bar at all. In fact, this is a very wide open area that they have kept that you can revise Form 3CB of even 2016-17 today. So, but the right technical answer to that is till the time my income tax returns could be revised, my Form 3CB could be revised.
So then in that case, it can be submitted, the revised one can be submitted at the time of assessment also. That's what.
Technically, no. Technologically, yes. The way how, so I don't know the current income tax side, but till a month back, we were able to do Form 3CBs of really past years. Yeah.
But there is no non-compliance which happens because Form 3CB is having a particular date and all these complications do not arise in that case that when I'm revising it.
So of course it arises. Of course it arises. That's why I said technically it is not correct.
Okay.
But technologically it has been made possible. Ideally, technologically also it shouldn't have been possible.
Yeah, because the same thing is happening even with Form 3CD, as you said, that technically I may not be in a position to revise, but the site allows it to be
right.
revised.
They should not allow it. That's what I feel. There should be some control there.
Yeah.
And next is on the flip side, extremely important because many a times when Indian company is making payment to the foreign company and foreign company is receiving income from Indian company, Indian company files a Form 3CB, the foreign company does not undertake any transfer pricing analysis and it does not file it in India. That's not the case. It should maintain Form 3CB. It should also have return of income and file it with the Indian income tax authorities. India uses source as well as residence-based taxation, and that's why any source of income derived from India needs to be reported and filed for in India. So very important to file a form 3CB even of a non-resident in India on the income that the non-resident has received from India. Any experiences here?
No, Akshayji, this part I did not understand. Will you elaborate this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So if there is an Indian company which is making a payment to a foreign company, so for say if the payment is made for fees for technical services,
Yeah.
the foreign company is receiving the income.
True.
The income that is been received, there will be certain tax withholding in India.
Barabar.
Now that tax withholding in India, the foreign company should actually file a return of income in India under normal provisions.
Yeah.
And there should also be a form 3CB submitted which states that there's an income of fees for technical services of the foreign company, and accordingly declare that there is a transfer pricing documentation that the foreign company has maintained in India. So even the foreign companies are liable to undertake the documentation as well as file form 3CB in India.
But on return filing, so long as this particular income is offered and no expenses claimed, then in that case there is an exemption available.
So
Oh.
that is right now. That is
Yeah.
right now, and when that's only true when you are going under the Income Tax Act, not
Oh.
under the DTAA.
Oh.
Okay, but even though under Income Tax Act there is an exemption from filing of return of income for I think FTS, royalties, and dividends.
True.
There is no exemption for Form 3CEB.
Okay.
So you need to file Form 3CEB, but you may not be filing form return of income for those transactions.
Okay. I think that 115A or something like that is.
Yes, 115A. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So actually, even for transaction like sale or purchase transactions, wherein no apparent income is generated in India, for them also the AEs
No,
need to
no.
file and
No, absolutely not for that, because income is not generated in India. Income is specifically all those income which are getting attracted under Section 9, especially uh, those incomes, not the purchase and sale.
And one more thing, for example, in case we show that this company, means the Indian company, is at the arm's length price, then won't the flip side entity will not be in arm's length price?
So ideally, if Indian company is at arm's length, the foreign company also should be at arm's length. But if you see, there is a range concept, right? So if the foreign company is exceeding that range, there could be a possibility that from a foreign company point of view, it was not at arm's length.
Not at arm's length, exactly.
Yeah. So we should fit in the range.
So we need to keep it fit into that range. Understood. Okay.
So I think rest all, frankly, is on BEPS. I would just like to take this one slide on BEPS because rest all is something that you can read through. BEPS as a project was given as a mandate by G20 countries to OECD to work on specific 15 action plans or action points for tax anti-avoidance. Yeah. Now, action plan number 13, OECD worked around in the transparency pillar, and specifically it was representing transfer pricing disclosures. And it came out with 3 solid plans to say that in transfer pricing, most of you are maintaining a local file. Local file is your transfer pricing study report. And you add that with the form 3CB. Now, every other country doesn't have form 3CB. So that particular local file surely needs to be maintained. However, on top of it, there is a concept called as master file, which gives information about the group on 5 specific aspects, which is the organizational structures, the M&E business overall, the intangibles, the financial activities, and the tax positions at the head office level, as well as wherever there is substantial business. Master file should be maintained in addition to the local file. The threshold for India for maintaining of master file is INR 500 crores of group turnover, along with the international transaction of 50 crores for tangible and 10 crores for intangible. Yeah. This is given in form 3C-EAA and 3C-EB. There is a particular format that we need to address. And the format of master file is very close to the format that has been specified by the OECD. It has certain variations, but it is very close to what is submitted by OECD. So if there is a parent company maintaining master file somewhere outside India, you can borrow a lot from that while filing for master file in India. Part A of master file is compulsory for all the companies which are undertaking transfer pricing compliances in India. Yeah. And there is a possibility of designation and all, but I don't want to get into those complications. Another important aspect that was proposed by OECD is the country by country reporting, which specifically gives a detailed allocation of income, profit, taxes, human resources across the various tax jurisdictions. And the applicability of this is for multinational companies. Right now, if I talk in INR terms, it is all multinational companies where global turnover is more than INR 6,400 crores. So these are ultra large multinational companies. And of course, there are certain compliances attached to it. And the typical form of 3CB, 3CEAD, I will just show you, is this. You have table 1, you have table 2, and all these fields tax jurisdiction wise, you need to fill in. This is given by OECD, and this will showcase all the relevant numericals jurisdiction wise, as well as constituent entity wise, uh, at one place, which would be then exchanged automatically between the jurisdictions. Yeah. So this is it. Before just closing, I would like to take you through certain penalty provisions. The most important penalty here to see is uh, penalty under section 270A and 271AA. Sorry, 271AA and 271G, where if there is a failure to maintain a documentation, then there is a straight penalty of 4% of your total international transaction. And that's why it's extremely important that documentation is maintained, and only on basis of such a documentation, the 3CB is undertaken. 3CB penalty is much lesser, which is 100,000 INR. But it's important that first the documentation is maintained, because 4% of international transaction could be a lot. Yeah. I think with this, I think in time, I would like to conclude. I'm going to leave back this entire PPT with all of you, so that in case if you have any doubts, more than happy to solve it. You can reach out to me on the email IDs, which is specified here. The email will reach me somehow for any doubts that you have, and more than happy to answer your questions. Any experience sharing now? I'm just keeping an open house for some time.
So while people are thinking and sharing the experiences, I will quickly like to tell you that our today's facilitator Akshay Kenkre has, to its credit, 3 very good books on transfer pricing. The names of them are Handbook on Basic Erosion Profit Shifting. Another one is General Anti-Avoidance Rules, and another one is Transfer Pricing Referencer. And these are published by very well recognized publishers like LexisNexis and Bloomsbury. So we are actually fortunate to have Akshay you today, because many times there are good writers, but they never speak. There are good speakers, they never write, and you are both of them. If Aditya is there, Aditya, you have been asking a few questions. I would request Aditya to summarize, unless somebody has got some experiences to share. But since we are slightly uh, out of the time, I would request Aditya to sort of summarize and let us know how he felt about today's conversation. Aditya?
Sure,
Yeah.
Sagar sir. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to first thank Akshay ji for coming and giving us these two amazing sessions. I have been practicing transfer pricing, but these two sessions have brought in light a lot of concepts, new concepts for me, and it was a new refreshing and new learning for all of us. Summarizing today's session, we went through many transactions, various transactions which have to be reported in 3CEBs. Akshayji took us through all of them. He took us through the BEPS projects transaction, penalty provisions, etc. So thank you so much, Akshayji, for taking a good session for all of us.
Yeah, the pleasure is all mine.
Yeah, and more importantly, he explained actually almost all the clauses in brief one by one. So that was also very informative, because sometimes it so happens that we read the clause but we do not understand the context. We sometimes get confused where certain information is to be put. So all this was very nicely explained by Akshay in a very short period. So that's what I feel. Aditya, I think you will agree with me.
Yes, sir, I surely would.
And Akshay, you are always welcome. I mean, it looks like you have concluded your sessions, but I mean, we'd like to have part 3, part 4 also, depending on your availability of the time and the contents which you feel like sharing from time to time. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, that this will be also uploaded for the benefit of everybody on the YouTube. And Akshay is also very much approachable, and I would suggest that sometimes it is always better to take help of the person who is really expert in the field, rather than just putting something like a filling up of the form. And he is really helpful. I have been in touch with him for quite some time, and in spite of his busy schedule, even if he is unable to pick up a call, he will always call back after some time whenever he's free, and spends time on telephone with me. So it's very nice. He's a very nice person also. Thank you, Akshay, and thank you all participants and the members who are coming here, and almost 30-35 members listen to your presentation, Akshay. I need to thank all of them for, because without the participants and they being curious and asking the questions, the discussion would have become actually one-sided, which did not happen today, definitely. And this is the speciality of this kind of meetings.
No,
Will
100%.
yeah.
One
100%.
small thing, Akshayji, I will just like to talk on behalf of this group that unfortunately Sagar happened to say that Akshayji will be concluding. But the rule of this group is actually once you are with us, you are always with us, So
No,
I will
100%.
request that
100%.
do take some sessions by designing something specially for this particular group, and we will be too happy to really speaking attend.
Yeah, in fact, I have not spoken about much on transfer pricing litigations,
Yeah.
and this group is an appeal group, and I wanted to first set a base for transfer pricing as such, so that we all are onboarded in terms of what happens in TP, and I think that expectations we have really crossed. So we all are very much into TP, and I think I'll be happy to take any further sessions on appeals, especially TP appeals, and we can definitely do that maybe once in 3 months or so. We can surely, because every time we can't do TP. Even I would like to learn other aspects of taxes, so I would be an audience, and I would silently hear and participate also on the other aspects of appeals. But I would love to take sessions on TP appeals, and those sessions can go on and on. It can be 3, 4, 5, 6 till 100. It's never ending. every day there are 10 cases which are coming out. So
My only request will be, really speaking, ki before proceeding into the appeal, if at all we can, really speaking, have something about the TP assessment per se. That is what.
I'll
It will
craft
be
it out. I'll
yeah,
craft it out for the group.
that is something. I know we are asking too much and
No,
taking a
no.
lot of liberties actually. So
No,
sorry for that.
No, please don't say so, sir. I mean, this is all in the learning. Even I learn a lot out of this, and it will give me an opportunity also to pen down certain things which I can share as an experience in assessments.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Can I suggest something? I mean, Akshay, actually, we had a wonderful session with you, and
Yes,
I'm
sir.
really happy. I mean, you added really good amount of value to our knowledge. But I'll be really happy if you can anytime take another session where, without naming the companies, because those are the privacy issues and secrecy issues. But if you can share some live, cases where you have, gone through different particular cases where, one can really correlate with some of our other clients' issues as well, probably.
No, Pakka, we can take cases on a name basis because these are all publicly available cases. These are good cases to talk about, and these are very business oriented. So every case would be different than the other one. And TP cases are such that generally they end up at tribunal because most of them are fact finding. So tribunal is the last fact finding authority. So they don't get admitted at high courts at all. So TP are very fact oriented cases, and these are generally resolved till tribunals. So I would be happy to do that. I will definitely take in. And your deemed international transaction, if that is something that is a live case with you, happy to discuss with you offline and contribute. That's absolutely not an issue.
Sure. Thanks once again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone, for a very patient hearing. It has
Thanks a
been
lot.
really lovely discussing these things with you.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Akshay.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Akshayji. And thank you so much, Sagarji, for arranging this for us.
Thank you, Akshay. And thank
So
you all.
just a second, I need to pause the recording.